And I've heard a lot of great buzz and excitement around what you heard this morning in the small group sessions. And I think there'll be a lot of buzz and excitement about what you're about to hear now, which is kind of a grand tour or expose or tour de force of what's going on right now across the globe. We've got a great speaker, Bruno Kaufmann, who many people in Sweden know, and many people internationally now. He's engaged with participation in many ways. He's a journalist, he's a thinker, he's been a politician, and he's just kind of crossed the world to looking at what's happening when it comes to democratic innovation. And I know that Bruno's got some strong thoughts about how we think about democracy and the story that a lot of us tell about where democracy is going. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say about and what he's seen and heard and what excites him in the next 40 minutes. So, Bruno, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really sorry that I disturb you in your coffee break. But I got my time to talk and I will use it. It's a good time to come to Stockholm. Today there will be in the movie theater a movie starting En bra vecka för demokratin. It's called A Good Week for Democracy. So I hope this hour and this day and this year and the future will be good for democracy. And that's really something I'm very concerned about, I'm very passionate about. And it's also a very specific and special day for me today here, because tonight I will go home. I will go home after 200 days of traveling around the world, trying to find out about the state of democracy, the thoughts of democracy, which kind of people are working for it. So I want to share that a little bit with you. But as a good citizen, I want to start with a complaint against the organizers. Because I was 200 days on a trip, so I proposed to get 80 minutes to talk about my trip. But I got 44 minutes, and now it's 40 minutes only. But with this complaint, I also want to say that I will not complain more. I will talk about what I have experienced, and especially I will not complain, for example, about these guys. And I will not complain about people who are, because of these guys and other developments, very skeptical about our democracies, who want to abolish elections, who are saying that democracy is just fake, we have to have another system. I will not complain about these guys. And I will not complain about the people who thought and think that I was just on a holiday. Because this picture is not really representative of my time. But it's a nice picture, I have to say. And it was a nice place, and it's a place I will talk about a little bit more. But I had something with me on my trip around the world. It's my experience, it's my work, but also my networks, my contacts, and also the idea of making democracy more democratic is a necessity everywhere to make democracy sustainable for the future. So the Global Passport to Modern Direct Democracy was one of the publications I was involved in just before going on this trip. It's a publication about certain basic criteria for participation and direct participation of the citizens. It's published together with International IDEA. It's an organization here based in Stockholm. It's an intergovernmental organization of 25 member states, and it's an organization which really supports democracy all around the world. So my tour, I called sometimes the Global Passport Tour to Modern Direct Democracy. My background is that I'm a citizen of Switzerland and a citizen of Sweden, and that's very convenient in many places because people can't really differ between these countries. So I'm always saying, whatever you want. And this is, of course, just one part. The other part is that both countries are, as you know, countries who have had the privilege of developing democracy over hundreds of years. Switzerland last year celebrated to not be involved in war for 500 years. Sweden, it's more than 200 years since the last war of Swedish troops outside the country. So in these two countries, democracy has been developed in very deep ways. Switzerland, with a focus on participation in direct democracy. As a Swiss citizen, I have participated in more than 1,000 popular votes on all levels. And in Sweden, we have this tradition and this history of transparency, of openness, which are very much universal ideas now today. So both these countries can contribute a lot, and I have been very active both in Switzerland and in Sweden, but also as a citizen of the European Union to promote more participatory democracy. In Sweden, most recently, I was member of a city government in Falun until last September, where we worked hard to make the city a democracy city, to introduce infrastructure for participation. We also established the idea of the passport to direct democracy, a little handy guide to every citizen in the municipality to learn about his and her rights, and also how this and her rights can be used, how they can be supported. And we have done a lot of these kind of promotional activities, supportive activities, which we have heard also from many, many places now around the world here during these 2 days. This idea of the democracy passport from Falun has in fact been picked up by the European Union, so we were honored to produce such a passport also to the European Union, which is now published in 23 languages. But my main job is to be a reporter. I worked with the Swedish radio, I worked with newspapers in Europe, and since last year I'm the Global Democracy Correspondent for the Swiss Public Broadcasting Company, which is, as the Swedish radio, financed by household fees. And in fact, the debate about how this works is very much a debate about democracy, about the infrastructure of democracy. What does it need to have a good democracy? It needs good information, it needs good openness, transparency. And there were people in Switzerland who didn't like this household fee of about 4,000 Swedish crowns, or you can say $500 a year to be paid. So they made a citizen initiative, which is possible under a Swiss law. They gathered 100,000 signatures. So in March this year, we got a national referendum on the broadcasting company, and 72% of the people voted no to abolish it. So we can continue our work. And Swissinfo, it's the foreign service of the Swiss broadcasting company, and we are publishing in 10 languages. So my task was, during this trip, to every week do several reports, audios, videos, texts about my findings. And basically, the fundamental issue, the fundamental question I was putting to myself ahead of this trip is what Foreign Affairs just made a title about in spring, in the May number, is democracy dying? So that's a question I took with me on the trip, and a question which is of course very serious because there are good reasons to discuss it, but you will see that my answer is no. Democracy is winning. And that's a very big difference, of course. And this has to do with a lot of things. It has to do with the evidence, with the findings. I mean, we are hearing from different kind of research institutions about how bad democracy is behaving or performing, that there is a decline in it. But at the same time, there are others who are looking more deeply into what's going on in the world. They are saying just the contrary. I will get back to that. What I want to share with you is a little bit about my trip. The trip went around the world. Of course, you can say not to all places. I was visiting 20 countries, 100 cities or villages, and there are so many more places. And I couldn't, of course, visit all the world, but I saw quite some interesting parts. And I did these reports every week, which you still can follow. They are published on swissinfo.ch/direct democracy. And I tried to really address different kind of challenges when it comes to democracy of today. Like the issue of ecology, of course, the issue of separation, independence, the issue also of new constitutions. And in all of different kind of places, you see this kind of enormously interesting developments. I did a lot of reports, short videos about it on different places. And I want to start with this place, Winnipeg. Who has been to Winnipeg of you? Yeah. And do you know what this house is? behind me? No, it's the museum, Canadian Museum for Human Rights. It's a great place. It's a national museum, just opened 3 years ago, and it's all about human rights related to our fundamental rights of democracy, of freedoms. And it's such a great place because it's, in a way, showing the complexity we are living into our societies. It's not just about the violations towards human rights, but also about the successes. It's an architecture which makes a blend between dark and light. And there is a tower of hope. It's about 100 meters. You see around the prairies, this museum for human rights is built on a place where 3 rivers go together, where the native people of Canada met for thousands of years, and where the first agreements between the new inhabitants, the colonialists from Europe, and the Indians agreed on their treaties. So it's really a symbolic place, but it's also a place which is about a fundamental human right I'm very much taking with me when I discuss these issues. It's Article 21(1) of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is in fact celebrated for 70 years now on December 10, and which is a universal human right to democratic participation, which is written into that. And this gives me initially a little bit the opportunity to say a few words about the understanding of modern democracy as I took it with me on this trip. I mean, democracy is very much, on one side, a great idea. We know all about that. It's very popular. Basically, everybody around the world subscribes to it. But at the same time, of course, we also know the reality is so different. And between this great idea and these harsh realities, it's the space of life, it's the space of tensions, it's the space of work. What we are doing here, what we are talking about, it's all about this difference between idea and reality. And it will be always a difference, because there will never be a perfect democracy, and there should never be a perfect democracy. But democracy, and this is the history, the great history of democracy, is of course built on certain notions and values. It's based on dialogue before decision. This has been the very ancient idea already from the Greeks, that the big difference between a democracy and a non-democracy is that you talk to each other before you make a decision. And this, of course, can increase and should increase the legitimacy of the decision, which is made by majority. And thirdly, this together creates freedom, not in a traditional way of freedom, of individual freedom, of richness as such, but freedom by acting together. In a democracy, you are acting together and you get freedom through that. That's a notion the famous German philosopher Hannah Arendt put down, that freedom in a democracy is acting together. And we need tools to act together. We need institutions, we need infrastructure, we need all what we are talking about in our public spheres, in local communities, in regional, national, transnational ones. This is creating freedom under democratic notions. And today we have basically the big challenge, how we can develop our representative governments into representative democracies. It's not the same. Representative government is basically electing somebody to govern. But the representative democracy is based on much more. It's based on protection of our individual or collective rights, the human rights, the fundamental rights. It's based on efficient system of delegation, elections, giving mandates, and also it's based on a comprehensive approach to participation. That's the issue, of course, of today, and it's one of the big issues of our democratic conversations all around the world, because while delegation has been developed very well and very comprehensively and into a way of making representative government feasible, participation has been very much behind. And that's the reason why I talk so much about participation today. Additionally, of course, and this is the backlash to the human rights issues, is that the protection of basic human rights is questioned by many of those leaders I'm not complaining about. So my approach to all these discussions is basically that in a democracy, all voices are heard every day and all votes are counted on election day. The result of such a democracy is a society of happy losers. And that's a very important notion, because in many countries where democracy has been introduced, it's all about winning power. And when you are in power, you can do everything. When you're not in power, you lose everything. And that's the reason why everybody tries to cheat, everybody tries to manipulate, everybody tries to use its power in a way which doesn't benefit society. So, having a democracy where the losers are as happy as the winners is really one of the goals. Now, let's go back to the trip. I have to say that the trip was organized in a way that I could use as many trains as possible around the world, because I think trains are a good way of meeting people, a good way of traveling. It's also a good way of ecologically traveling. So I traveled on most parts on the lands on train, from New Zealand, Australia, Indonesia, up all the way to China, Taiwan, Japan, and then to United States, of course, not by train, but through the United States and Canada again by train. So I basically, on this 200 days trip, I was maybe about 25 nights on a train. But there were so many places, so many instances where I really maybe did know a little bit about it, but I really could go more into depth and understand why is it like it is. One of these places you see here is the state capital of Hawaii state. It's the youngest state of the United States, in Honolulu. And it's really a different kind of parliament house. It's an open house. It's like a place where everything is transparent and open, and where you just can take the elevator. There's no security. You can go to the governor. You can go to the chamber. There's nobody asking you for an ID. It's just an open place. And the legislators, they have no back door. So when you go there, they cannot disappear. And to ensure that, they have one floor which is dedicated to public access and public access support. These two persons are the leaders of this public access room, which is basically a democracy center for the citizens. They can have their desks there, they can use telephones, they can use computers. It's all for free to make the citizens really in charge also of their representatives. It's a very interesting place to study. Another such place is Seoul's Citizen Hall. It's the capital of Korea, which in very short time developed from being the seat of a very autocratic military system into, I would say, one of the most developed democratic places, and where the current mayor has done everything to be not, let's say, the leader of the city, but to be a servant of the city and to listen to the people and to enable the development of an infrastructure for participation. It's Mayor Park Won-hye and his deputy who are very much promoting the idea of the city as the heart of democratizations around the world. And as you know, Seoul is not a small place, it's about 20 million people, so it's a very powerful place for that. A very different place is the island nation of Palau. Who has been to Palau? I can tell you what I want. Okay, that's great. Now, Palau is really an interesting place. It's a very small place by population, just 20,000 people, but it's also a place where you can see what you can do when you are deeply democratic. For instance, it starts when you touch down on the airport in Palau. You don't get a visa or you don't get something like a bureaucratic form to sign in. You just have to sign a pledge that you protect the nature, that you don't take something away from the place, that you really are in accordance with the nature of the ocean and of the Palau place. And it's a very powerful idea of changing our ways of making, especially tourists. And it was based on a citizen initiative in Palau a few years ago. And Palau has a parliament. Palau was until 1994 under the United States and then got its independence by popular vote. And the national parliament is called the Olbil Era Kelulua, and that means the house of whispering decisions. So it's the idea of that you don't have to shout, you don't have to be very in confrontation, you have to whisper with each another to find out what's a good solution. And this is, of course, based on traditional forms of Palau democracy in assembly halls. They have a very interesting national capital. You see here on this little picture down, you see the president's house, you see the capital, you see the judiciary, and then on the right side also the traditional house of Palau meeting. And it's a fantastic place. In fact, it's 16 states, 16 independent states. Each state has its own constitution and its own elections and its own system of participation. And for many of the states, you have to take a vote. And the Palau Election Commission, which I visited, is one of these places where you really are so impressed about how a few people can make a difference. They explained to me how they gather, for instance, of one of the states, the votes. They have to hire a big boat because it's far away. It's about 5 days by boat to go there. And there are 5 voters. And every vote costs about $7,000 to gather. But they have the elections in this proper way and organize that. And Maria, the chair of the election commission in Palau, is one of these persons I really found to be such like a picture of what democracy is about today in the world, that people who dedicate their life to make democracy working. I mean, we are very often talking about we want to have more democracy, better democracy, everything we are doing is not good enough. But at the same time, what we do in all our places, in municipalities, in regions, in organizations, it's so much, it's so impressive, but it's very seldom honored because it's seen as a self-evident part. But without that, without this good conduct, everything would be nothing. So these kind of activities are enormously important. This is another person I met in Fukushima in Japan. It's a journalist who moved there after the nuclear disaster to report, but also to report about how the people there are dealing with the consequences of the disaster. And he took me on the 7th anniversary of the Fukushima disaster to the place which still closed down. So when we visit this place here, he said in 10 minutes the police will come, so we have to be very brief, and it's still a very high radiation. But the nuclear disaster of Fukushima has, of course, created a lot of, let's say, movements, activities around Japan, which can also be used for much more of democratization. These 3 men I met in Yogyakarta in Indonesia. They are a very impressive place. It's called the Muslim Institute for Democracy, and they are basically working for LGBT rights, for gender equality, for all kinds of issues which are profound for a modern society out of a religious setting. As you know, in Indonesia, it's still like that you have to apply, you have to be member of a church, of a religion denomination in order to be a voter, for instance. And this struggle around reconciling a strong religious setting with a democracy is so impressive. And for me, Indonesia is one of these places where really the future of democracy is about to be, in a way, also decided, because it's a place of enormous diversity between rural and cities. I mean, Java has 130 million people on a size which is much, it's about a little bit more than Switzerland. So it's a place where really democracy is in the making, and in June there will be local elections. So what Indonesia achieved in the recent years is to devolve democracy from a centralistic concept to a more localist concept, where local mayors, local governors have much more importance, much more to say. And I think that's one of the profound reforms for participation to be considered. Another guy I met in Cairns, Australia, Greg, he's the convener and organizer of something called the Citizens for the Great Barrier Reef. And it addresses basically one of the big challenges we have today, that democracy may be organized on land within certain borders, within certain community established, but not outside, not in the sea, not in the oceans. And most of our planet is the ocean, is the sea. I visited it, certain small islands in the Great Barrier Reef, and I could see how the invasion of plastics, the consequences of over-industrialization is so much damaging that a whole ecosystem is really much questioned. So what they try now on the north-east coast of Australia is to develop something like a global citizen concept for this kind of non-land communities, and Greg works a lot of that. On all this, there are stories I have written. I can, of course, not tell you all the small things here now. Now, what I did in many places is not just meeting people and report about their activities, but also to engage in conversations about modern democracy, how it works on local places, what they are doing, what other places are doing. I mean, this exchange is extremely powerful because, I mean, we are all working on the local, regional level, but at the same time, everybody else does it around the world also. And this conference is a good proof of that, that we can learn a lot from each another. This is a place in Australia I had a conversation. Other places, like in Taiwan, I had a lot of interesting discussions to develop a democracy center in a city for NGOs, and in a Japanese tea house about how they can create a more local governed school system, which is extremely central today. And everywhere we had this kind of discussions about what does it mean to become a little bit more democratic, because every place has its own culture, its history, so you cannot just move a system of one place to another, but you can always encourage that it is possible to go a little bit more from the idea of democracy to the reality of democracy. So this was really a tour of exchange, of learning, which I would say certain titles, when I went through all my articles now, I would just like to address a little bit more. One is when it comes to the US and America, we all know and we are mostly concerned about developments at the national level, this dysfunctionality of a representative government which is so confrontational and where, as we have seen, they are not happy losers, but they are basically angry winners. And where we can see at the same time, and that was on my tour, I was 2 times in the US, that there is a lot of movements, a lot of engagement, a lot of empowerment through this crisis. So one of the titles of my stories were America's Democracy Learns to Live with Trump. And it's really a little bit about that. I mean, meeting colleagues at the Washington Post, they said they have added about 800 people just in 1 year to their editorial staff. 800 people. We are talking about the crisis of the press, of the media, but this kind of crisis creates such a lot of interest in reporting, in fact-checking, in good journalism, that I would say maybe Trump is really a gift to American democracy. Now, as I already said, another place which was very impressive to me is visiting different kind of big local communities in Indonesia, where, for instance, in a place called Surabaya, and as you know, this place got some bad really news last week when there was an attack on churches. But in Surabaya, a mayor called Risma has really changed this kind of old industrial autocratic place into a very livable participatory place. It's called the most participatory city in Asia nowadays, and this was very impressive to see, while, for instance, on the other side, an old Asian place in Java, Yogyakarta, which is still a monarchy, there is a battle between the old and the new system very much in place. And where the people I met, for instance, they were just arrested the other day because they were complaining about the building of a new airport, which wasn't at all part of a public conversation. Thirdly, and this is another very good, let's say, development, is Taiwan. Taiwan is a place, as you know, it's a country of 23 million people, which is contested by a neighbor, but at the same time has been able to go from a military dictatorship to a very vibrant democracy with a very vibrant local democracy scene, where they have developed their legislation for participation in a very impressive way, where, for instance, now the citizens of the country can propose new laws They can request a vote on a law already made in Parliament by gathering signatures, but not just in a confrontational way, but in a very conversational way. That means I was following that very closely when I was there now, that if you gather a couple of thousand of signatures, you get a conversation with both government and authorities. How can we label this question in the best possible way to get a good debate? And if you then, in the second step, gather 280,000 signatures, you get a vote. But still there, you will have a lot of conversational, additional support from the government. So it's really about inviting the citizens not to keep out, but to come in and to make their voices heard. I think that's very impressive to see how in Taiwan this is developing. As you have seen, I use sometimes the hashtag #MyRoadToRome, and this whole trip has also been a trip to Rome in a way. Because in Rome this year, in September, we will have a global forum on participatory and direct democracy. It's the 8th such forum, which I'm co-chairing together with a colleague from Los Angeles, another journalist, where we want to engage people in a similar way like here, but maybe in a even broader sense, also citizen activists from all kinds of walks of life, city mayors, administrators, journalists, to discuss how can we make our democracies more democratic. And in this way, you have to engage, of course, with the leaders of a city who wants to be involved in that, like the mayor of Rome, where we signed a memorandum last year to not only organize events. Events are nice, but the process around events, the discussion which is evolving out of an event, that's the decisive thing. And Rome committed at that time to change and to develop its own city charter to become much more participatory, and also to engage in a global network of democracy cities, which we want to establish with the support of the Council of Europe to create a Magna Charta for democracy cities, something we certainly can discuss with many of you in the future. So the Global Forum on Modern Direct Democracy will take place this October, and the trip was also part of the preparation for that. So again, is democracy dying? That was the question I was taking with me. There is relevance. There are facts and data who are showing that certain criteria of democracy are really in decline. The most famous is American Freedom House, going into certain criteria, variables, and they just concluded that countries with decline in freedoms have outnumbered those with gains for the past 9 years. So this data would underwrite and would support the thesis of the decline. We have also the Economist, who is coming up with its yearly index on democracy, and even there you can say there was a backlash. But again, and that's the problem of this kind of data, that they are selecting very strictly a few criteria. What's freedom? What's democracy? And for instance, International IDEA, with its state of global democracy, doesn't just look on 15 criteria, like for instance Freedom House, but on 150. And there is also the Varieties of Democracy research project, where Gothenburg is, University of Gothenburg is a leader, which looks in even more. And both this more extensive research show it's not the case that democracy is backlashing, it's on the rise, as you can see, for instance, in these clear numbers of International IDEA. And also, we can see that the hunger for democracy is not backlashing, it's not going back. In fact, international study on World Survey shows that the big majorities of people in the world really see representative democracy as something to achieve, including, in fact, also most of the people, forms of participatory and direct democracy. So this is very much encouraging. We can also see that most countries do have already provisions for participatory and direct democracy. In 80% of all countries around the world, there has been popular votes also on issues in the last 25, 30 years. And in fact, and this is the key finding of my whole trip, is that it's on the local and urban area. You see the big cities on this map around the world, they are really so much more diverse. They're much more, let's say, dynamic than the national maps. They are developing in overlapping ways around the world, and they are the powerhouses of democratizations in many ways. So I want to conclude with my 3 takeaways, and I hope we will have some time maybe for questions and discussion as well. My 3 takeaways from this trip are, first, that we are, in fact, today living in a post-paternalistic world. In fact, many schools, many working places, many families are far from the ideas of paternalistic one head, one man rule as we have had maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago. But still, most of our political systems, most of our cultures of democracy are very paternalistic, are still about one leader or a few leaders, about a few people in charge, and the others are just looking and consumers. So there we have a big challenge, a big gap, and maybe also it's the reason why so many people today are angry and frustrated and feeling that we are in the wrong direction. But I think it's a lot about this thinking about these realities which have changed so profoundly. Secondly, the local is the new global. It's really on the local level, cities to cities, regions to regions who are working together. Local leaders are gaining in power around the world, also on global issues. I mean, when certain international treaties by head of states are not subscribed longer, there are cities who are picking up it and say, we will work on that in the future, especially, for instance, on climate change, on migration, on education. There are so many great initiatives on the local level. And thirdly, as I've said before, and I really deeply think that's true, democracy is winning. And you and we are all very much part in this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Bruno. I mean, that really is a long way round to get to Rome. And it's fascinating to hear all these experiences. I thought I'd pick up on a question, I guess, because you've highlighted a tension or I guess a creative challenge. That on one hand you talk about the International Declaration of Human Rights and global citizenship, and then when you talk about the examples, as you said, they're often very local and very contextual. And so for me, there is this constant, when we have the international conferences, the tension between the people who say we're all the same and we can, transplant things and universal methods, and then the people who say, oh, it won't work here because my context is so specific. How do you see that playing out in terms of these democratic movements for democratic innovation? Is it universal, or is it local, or is it both?
I mean, that's the beauty of the discussion, of the conversations we are into today. I mean, 30 years ago, when I discussed these kind of issues, somebody would say to me, look, that's your culture, that's your way of doing it. It has no relevance to us. And already, I mean, in this 30 years, especially in the 90s, as a journalist, I experienced, for instance, how the issue on European integration created much more transnational discussions. I mean, nowadays, Brexit is such a huge issue in Europe, and people really dealing with it. I was following, for instance, as a reporter, the first vote in Denmark, 1992, about the Maastricht Treaty. There were 3 foreign journalists. They said no. The next year was another vote. There were 500 journalists. So the public interest for global issues has increased very much. And of course, it's much easier, much more simple today to reach out, to discuss, to tweet. But at the same time, of course, there are all these risks related to that. I mean, we know it. It's not easy to verify a news, a picture from somewhere. It's very easy to manipulate. And this kind of being able to deal with this diversity and this, at the same time, being local and global, this is, of course, will be a big challenge for all of us, because we are seeing it everywhere, because migration is everywhere an issue, global economic issues are all these issues are, there is the nation state is far too small, but the actors as such needs to be more close to the people, because otherwise what happens is what many people still, I mean, really experience today, that they think Brussels is far away, Washington is far away. I mean, all these international meetings is not about our interests, it's about the interest of a small elite. So reconnecting citizens and local communities with these global issues, it's not an option, it's It's just something we have to do, and we can do it better or worse.
And you've mentioned the kind of challenge, you mentioned Trump as in a way something which has spurred on innovation. And I think it's interesting to look at many of the places you lifted up as good examples, that they've come out of very autocratic or been dictatorships, and actually there's been a real opportunity to quickly innovate. How important is a crisis or those kind of difficulties as a spur for these kind of changes? And can we, in countries like Sweden, which have been relatively peaceful and perhaps relatively stable, is there a way of getting that dynamism without having to manufacture a crisis?
That's hard. That's really hard. I mean, as I said before, I was active in a city, Falun, for 7 years about these issues, and my colleagues are here as well, discussing why do we need to promote democracy in such a peaceful, nice place? Because some people would say, we don't have to work for democracy. We are a democracy. We have always been a democracy. So it's like when you never reflect on why can you walk. I mean, you have just learned it at some point, and society is there. And somebody also told to me sometime in a conference here in Sweden, why do you want to change something which is working so well? Why do you want to make participation, direct democracy feasible? That's not necessary. We have good leaders. We have good parties. We have the system. And this is, of course, the problem of all successes, that you in a way are pressed to learn. And you could also define power, political power, which the right to not to learn. So if you have too much political power, you don't have to learn. And you don't have to learn from others. You don't have to see what others are doing. And maybe Trump and others are expressions of this idea that whatever you say, you can say whatever stupidity you say, you are still the greatest man on earth.
And looking at all these good examples, innovations, and the opportunity to actually start to grow local innovations and institutions, are there any common threads, anything that you think binds them together, anything that creates a good fertile soil for these kind of ideas to develop and grow?
Yes, there are many. And one is, of course, to be impatient, to see shortcuts, to, for instance, understand technology as a way to bypass a non-welcoming culture for democracy. I mean, there is a belief that we should go quickly to much better situation. And there is a risk that this kind of projects we are all working in, that they want to describe something which is not existing. Or, in other words, that we make the idea we describe to a reality which doesn't exist. And this is a big risk that, because also, of course, leaders or elected people who are not very interested in this kind of discussions, they can instrumentalize this. And you see in many places around the world that these forms of participatory democracy, technologies we are discussing, are very dependent on a few leaders. So it's participation for the nice sunny days, but as soon as it begins to rain, everything is away again. And this makes people even more angry than before. So the promise of more democracy is a very dangerous one if we don't take it seriously and if we don't have the patience, and especially if we are ourselves not happy losers.
So to sum up, we have to be impatient, but also patient, taking small steps, and then designing participation for the rainy days and not just for the good times.
Yeah, I mean, we have to be very ambitious, and very humble at the same time. That's right.
So you've left us with a very challenging path ahead, but thank you so much indeed, Bruno.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.